September 12, 1944. Near the ruined junction of Verdun, France, beneath a sky choked with ash and the fading echoes of artillery, Generalmajor Friedrich von Lüttwitz stood motionless beside a cratered rail line. The air smelled of diesel, wet earth, and something else, something mechanical and relentless that his trained mind could not yet name. He had been summoned by his staff officers to witness what they described, in hurried whispers, as impossible. In his gloved hand, he clutched a pair of Zeiss binoculars, their lenses still smudged from the morning's reconnaissance. Behind him, 3 junior officers waited in silence, their faces pale not from fear of Allied bombers, but from what they had seen moving through the French countryside under cover of darkness. Von Lüttwitz raised the binoculars. What he observed in the pre-dawn gloom would later appear in his captured field reports as a single, underlined sentence. The Americans do not move armies. They pour them. The German High Command had spent 5 years perfecting the art of Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Their doctrine relied on speed, concentration, and the calculated movement of men and machines along interior lines. Rail transport was the iron backbone of this strategy. The Reichsbahn Germany State Railway had moved entire panzer divisions across Europe with tectonic precision, adhering to schedules measured in hours, sometimes minutes. German officers understood logistics as a science of scarcity. Every rail car counted, every ton of fuel rationed, every kilometer of track a strategic asset to be defended or destroyed. When the Wehrmacht studied Allied capabilities in early 1944, their intelligence assessments acknowledged American industrial strength, but dismissed their organizational capacity. The Americans, Berlin reasoned, were wealthy but wasteful, powerful but poorly coordinated. They could build ships and planes in staggering numbers, yes, but moving a modern army across a devastated continent required more than factories. It required the kind of disciplined, methodical planning that only German staff officers had mastered. This assumption, like so many others, would shatter against the reality of what the U.S. Army Transportation Corps unleashed upon liberated France. What von Lüttwitz witnessed that September morning was the culmination of a logistical miracle that had begun 3 months earlier, in the chaotic weeks following D-Day. By late August 1944, Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing eastward across France, pursuing a Wehrmacht in full retreat. General Dwight Eisenhower faced a problem that would have paralyzed lesser commands. His armies were outrunning their supply lines. Fuel, ammunition, rations, everything needed to sustain nearly 2 million men, had to travel from Normandy's beaches across hundreds of kilometers of war-torn countryside. France's rail network, systematically bombed by the Allies themselves before the invasion, and then sabotaged by retreating Germans, lay in ruins. Bridges collapsed into rivers, locomotives sat gutted beside twisted tracks, stations were rubble. Into this chaos stepped the U.S. Army Transportation Corps, armed not with weapons, but with an almost incomprehensible abundance of rolling stock, spare parts, and a uniquely American approach to problem solving. If the system is broken, build a new one. German planners had calculated that rebuilding France's railways would take months, perhaps years. The Americans did it in weeks. Engineer battalions, many composed of men who had worked for railroads in civilian life, Southern Pacific switchmen, Pennsylvania railroad mechanics, Chicago yardmasters, descended upon the wreckage with cutting torches and cranes. They didn't restore the French system, they Americanized it. Standardized U.S. locomotives, shipped in pieces from Baltimore and assembled in Norman fields, began pulling freight along repaired lines at speeds that defied European precedent. But speed was only part of the transformation. What truly separated American rail operations from anything the Germans had encountered was scale wedded to flexibility. While the Reichsbahn operated on rigid timetables, requiring extensive planning for every movement, the Americans treated their rail network like a living organism, constantly adapting to battlefield demands. A single telephone call from a forward supply officer could redirect an entire trainload of artillery shells. Schedules were rewritten hourly. Trains moved not in careful sequences, but in continuous streams, their movements orchestrated by a web of communications that linked every depot, every junction, every railhead in a system the Germans could scarcely comprehend. The numbers, when they reached German intelligence, were dismissed as propaganda. In September 1944, the U.S. Transportation Corps was operating more than 1,500 locomotives across France. These machines pulled trains that often exceeded 100 cars in length, unheard of in European practice, where shorter trains navigated older infrastructure. American trains ran day and night, their crews working in rotations, fueled by an endless supply of coal and diesel that seemed to materialize from nowhere. On a single day in late September, U.S. rail operations moved more than 25,000 tons of supplies eastward, more than the entire Wehrmacht could transport across all of occupied Europe in the same period. But tonnage alone doesn't capture what von Lüttwitz saw through his binoculars that morning. What broke the German general's composure was the continuity. Train after train emerged from the morning mist, each one a steel serpent a kilometer long, moving at speeds approaching 60 kilometers per hour across track that German engineers swore was too damaged for safe operation. There was no pause, no hesitation, no visible limit to their number. It was as if America had simply tilted westward and allowed its industrial might to pour across the Atlantic like a flood. German soldiers, accustomed to fighting on the edge of logistical collapse, watched this spectacle with something approaching despair. They had spent years learning to make do with less, stretching fuel rations, scavenging ammunition from battlefield dead, moving on foot when vehicles failed. Now they faced an enemy who seemed to operate by entirely different physical laws. A captured Oberst, interrogated in October 1944, told his American questioners, "We knew you had factories. We did not know you could make the factories follow your armies." He was referring to the mobile workshops, the portable repair depots, the entire self-sustaining ecosystem that American logistics created wherever it went. Behind every rail line stood warehouses filled with spare parts cataloged in triplicate, maintenance crews equipped with manuals that covered every possible breakdown, and a command structure empowered to make decisions without waiting for approval from distant headquarters. The Germans, for all their vaunted efficiency, had built a brittle system that excelled under ideal conditions but fractured under stress. The Americans had built something more resilient, organized chaos that somehow worked. At the heart of this system was a philosophy that German military culture found almost offensive. Where Wehrmacht logistics emphasized control, centralized planning, hierarchical authority, strict adherence to doctrine, American operations embraced what their field manuals called initiative at subordinate levels. A U.S. rail battalion commander in France had authority to requisition supplies, redirect trains, and solve problems on his own judgment, without waiting for orders from Paris or London. This decentralization drove German observers to distraction. How could a system function without iron discipline? The answer lay in something deeper than organizational charts. A cultural confidence in individual competence, a trust that the man on the ground understood his job and could be relied upon to do it. This wasn't just logistics, it was democracy made manifest in steel and steam, a reflection of a society that believed ordinary people, properly equipped and trained, could accomplish extraordinary things. The symbolic heart of this transformation was the locomotive itself, specifically the U.S. Army Transportation Corps S-160 class, a machine designed for exactly this moment. Unlike the elegant, specialized locomotives of European railways, the S-160 was deliberately simple, a steam engine built for rough handling, easy repair, and operation by crews with minimal training. More than 800 of these machines were shipped to Europe, and they became the workhorses of the Allied advance. German railway engineers, examining captured S-160s, were baffled by their crude construction, no aesthetic refinement, no engineering elegance, just brute functionality. But that crudeness was precisely the point. When an S-160 broke down, any competent mechanic could fix it using standard parts. When track conditions worsened, the S-160's forgiving suspension kept it running. The locomotive embodied American industrial philosophy. Build it strong, build it simple, build 10,000 of them. Perfection was the enemy of production, and production was what won wars. By October 1944, the German army in Western Europe was effectively immobile, starved of fuel and supplies, while American forces maneuvered with a freedom that would have seemed fantastical just months earlier. The U.S. Third Army, under General George Patton, covered more ground in 3 months than Napoleon's Grande Army had traversed in its entire Russian campaign, and it did so while maintaining supply lines that kept frontline units fed, armed, and fueled. The secret wasn't tactics or courage. Both sides had those. The secret was in the trains that ran all night, every night, carrying the weight of American industry toward the Rhine. German commanders, studying their maps in candlelit bunkers as the perimeter contracted, could hear those trains in the distance, a rhythmic mechanical thunder that never ceased, the sound of an unstoppable machine grinding their armies into history. In his final report before being relieved of command, von Lüttwitz wrote a passage that his superiors initially suppressed, fearing its effect on morale. "We are not fighting an army," he observed. "We are fighting a factory system that has learned to move. For every ton of supplies we transport, they transport 20. For every train we run, they run 50. This is not a question of courage or skill. This is mathematics, and the mathematics are unbearable." The general's words contained no defeatism, only the cold recognition of a professional soldier who understood that some battles are decided before the first shot is fired. Logistics, the unglamorous science of moving things from here to there, had become the dominant form of warfare, and America had mastered it with the same industrial genius it brought to aircraft production and shipbuilding. The transformation of France's railways was more than a tactical achievement. It was a preview of the post-war world. When German officers later sat in prisoner-of-war camps, discussing where their nation had gone wrong, many returned to that image. American trains running through the night, endless and unstoppable. They had assumed that industrial power was merely a matter of production. Build more tanks, cast more guns. They had failed to understand that true industrial dominance meant creating systems that could sustain themselves across continents, that could adapt to chaos, that could turn complexity into an advantage rather than a liability. The Americans hadn't just moved an army overnight. They had revealed a form of power that couldn't be bombed into submission or outmaneuvered by clever tactics. It was the power of abundance disciplined by organization, of wealth channeled through competence, of a society so productive that it could afford to be wasteful and still overwhelm its enemies through sheer material surplus. As dawn broke fully over Verdun that September morning, von Lüttwitz lowered his binoculars and turned away from the rail line. Behind him, the trains kept coming, their steel wheels singing against the rails, carrying forward the weight of a nation that had turned logistics into an art form and supply lines into instruments of strategic dominance. In the distance, a locomotive whistle sounded, not a warning, but an announcement. The future was arriving on schedule, faster than anyone had thought possible, and it would not stop until it reached Berlin. The rails themselves seemed to hum with purpose, carrying not just supplies but a message, that in modern war, victory belongs not to the most courageous or the most clever, but to those who can feed the furnace of battle without pause, without limit, without end. And on that morning in France, the furnace burned brightest in American hands, fed by trains that moved like clockwork through the ruins of an old world, building a new one with every mile of track they traveled.